Hi folks, good morning, and this was the demo that I could not complete last week, so I thought I would make it as a recording, and then of course you can play it at your leisure to see how Minikube works. There are many ways to install Minikube version, as we spoke about the other day. One way is to use Docker desktop, other way is to do a plain installation like what I've done now. It is also possible that you use sandboxes like Let's Play with K8s or Killer Code and so on and so forth. So the idea is to get the installation done. So if you go to get started, you will see that there are many ways in which you can get the installation going. Mine is a Windows machine, so you can see that I picked up Windows 684 stable release and executable download. It is also possible that if you use the PowerShell, you can directly download the exe and then set the environment as well. So you can see that there is a path that's being set by force, and then of course the exe is being grabbed from the GitHub and then being put inside C Minikube. This is how I've done the installation. What I like about it is you can also run the PowerShell as an administrator and add the existing path using the shell script, so which I've already done. So when these two steps are over, so I'm going to start the cluster to see how it runs. And of course, we will discuss the commands from then on. So I have two PowerShells with administrative rights open. So let's start the Minikube. So I'm going to say Minikube start, and you can see that it immediately starts the service. I've done the installation quite a few weeks before, so you can see that my profile is being picked. My virtual machine hypervisor VM is enabled, so that makes it easy for restarting as well. So the machine is being restarted, as you can see, and you will see that there is a scroller that goes by that completes all the necessary services to get the service started. So it may take a minute or two depending on how good your desktop is. In my case, I'm basically running only Minikube, none other. So I've tried to keep my settings clean. As you can see, I don't have any services running beyond the basic shell, so it should not take a long time. Let's see. I'm just checking if the recorder is running. Yes. And then you can see it's preparing the Kubernetes. Depending on how your Docker version and the CPU is being used, this may take from 2 to 3 minutes. In my case, I have a decent desktop, so you can see that's why the startup is pretty fast. I'm using 64 GB. So if I want to check the status, I can say Minikube status, and this you will see that it brings up all the 6 services that we were talking about. So at any point on time, when you want to see what kind of services are currently running, you can see that the control plane is on, the kubelet is running, the API server is running, and the kube configuration is all correct. I'm not trying to do any auto stop, so that's why the time to stop is non-existent. If I want to see the kind of nodes that I have inside this pseudo cluster, I can actually use Minikube and try it, but I want to show you how the client works. So I'm going to say kubectl get nodes. This basically gets all the current nodes inside the cluster. So you can see I only have a Minikube running, and basically I did this around June, so it's 66 days old, and the version that I'm running is 1.22. Of course, the latest is 1.24. You're free to upgrade it. I did not find any need to go and tweak it, so I just left it as such. It is also possible that you can check the version. You can check the version of the client side. You can check the version of Minikube as well. Version. So that gets you, sorry, I should say version. So that gets you the Minikube server-side version. If you're very keen to see what's the client-side version, you can say kubectl version there as well. So this basically gives you a very long timestamp version that's running. In case you want to see what's a shorter version, it's also possible that you get a shorter version. So you can use the same version command with the second operator. You'll see normally Kubernetes as well as kubectl uses double dash for all the container related commands. So I'm getting the shorter version. So the client side version is 1.22 as well. So that's pretty much what we have on the Minikube's main server side. Now, having said that, it is also possible for us to look into the dashboard. Okay. So there are many commands that you can work with when you're trying to talk about the Minikube version. For example, you can talk about IP address, you can talk about status. We tried status, so let's try IP address, for example. Just IP will do. This will tell you what's the current IP address that's being assigned. Okay? And it's also possible that you can start the dashboard. And when you say Minikube dashboard, you can see it takes a minute or two, and then it goes through all the services that's necessary to get the dashboard on. And you can see that there is a decent performance engineering and tracing facility that is available. So if you select the services that's currently running, it tells you how many endpoints you have, what are the active number of commands and things like that. So you can look at ingress settings if there is any. You can look at configuration maps that we spoke about. If there is any volume mounts, you can look at it. Secrets are managed as well. You can also create storage classes. The default one is for the path settings, and that's what is being shown here. So these are the basic idea. And when you go back to the dashboard, you can see that it constantly tells you how many times the server has been started, what are the initial traces, and so on and so forth. I've been giving demos on my online classes. I didn't have an online for the last 2-3 weeks. That's why you can see the dashboard was one I used a month ago. So this is the default dashboard that you can play around with when you're running the cluster. Now let's get started and try to do some interesting commands here to show you how the deployment works. Of course, there are many ways in which you can deploy things. This is just to give you a first look on how things work. Okay. So how do I start with that? Maybe I can start with NGINX because that's a very standard way to create a load balancer. So before that, I want to show you how the syntax works. Usually you say kubectl. You are also free to create a short name using ls. And if you say get nodes, it basically gives you the physical nodes that is currently available inside the cluster. So as you can see, I have only one pseudo cluster, so there's only one node that is currently running. Now if I want to see what kind of services are there, I can simply say get services. This basically gets me the current services that are running. If I want to know any individual component status, I can say get me all the component status. It tells me how the individual scheduler and other things work. I can also find out cluster information just to understand how the cluster settings happens. So I can say cluster information. That usually gets me the cluster info. So at the moment I don't have any cluster information, so it's a pseudo cluster, so that's why you can see that there is an error and it doesn't work out. Now if you want to see if there is any current deployments, it is possible for you to say just get deployment. Okay. So that gets you all the deployment. Currently there is none. You can also look for replica sets. As we said, this is the cloning we discussed on the scaling queue. At the moment we don't have any deployment set as well. I just want to use the default settings and then create an NGINX deployment. So I'm going to say kubectl. I'm going to create a deployment. So I'm going to say create deployment. I have to give a name to it. So I'm going to call this as my NGINX, the usual hello world style. And then of course I got to constantly point to the container image, right? So I'm going to say take the NGINX, which is officially the latest. So the moment you give this, you can see immediately there's a deployment created. You look at the deployment set, there is one node that is running. If you look at the replica set, there is one replica that is running as well. How does it decide it is one replica? Because the deployment file talks about it. If you're ever wondering what is inside the deployment file, you can say kubectl. We want to edit the deployment file this time to just see what's the default settings. I'm going to say edit deployment. And of course, I'm going to call my NGINX version of my deployment. So when I say this, you can see that the file comes out. And you see I've given the deployment a name. I've given some annotations. Of course, it's run currently, so it's taking the current timestamp. I've called it as my NGINX. As you can see, here is where I spent my replica time as 1. Okay, this is interesting, right? And we spoke about state management. So when I say state, whatever I change in my deployment file, you can see immediately takes effect inside the cluster status. So if you look at all the templates, you can see that I've created some metadata. This is the container image. I've put the image as container image comes from NGINX. Suppose I want to change the state. I'm going to say, instead of loading the latest Nginx server, why don't you load the 1.16 version? So I'm going to save this deployment, and immediately I'm going to close this deployment file so that the file takes effect. And immediately if you say get deployment, you will see that the older deployment was 88 seconds old. We can see that, did I even edit it? So let's try again. So I have changed my image to 1.16, maybe I'll say 1.17, save it and close it, and edited. Okay, so I'm going to say get deployment. You can see that the deployment basically takes effect. So let's go to the pod, then you can see how the pods are changing. You can see that the older one that is currently running, but the new deployment has taken effect within 12 seconds. So if you say get pods again, you will see that the older one is completely cleared. It's been 10 seconds now, so only the new one is running. Okay? So this tells me how state management has worked out for us. So all you got to do is to let the cluster orchestration tool, which is Kubernetes, say what kind of deployment you want, and immediately you can see that the pods work very hard to keep the state. This is very interesting, right? So you can think about fail safety, you can think about scaling, all these things via deployment files, and this is what we mean by very stylish declarative programming. Of course, we're going to talk a little bit more about declarative programming on the serverless session, but I hope this gives you an idea. But then, this is not just the load balancer. You can do the same with Tomcat server. You can do the same with your Flask and fast APIs in Python server. The same thing applies to your JavaScript server. So it's a very cool tool to very seamlessly activate any kind of pods that you want. Just for the flavor of it, suppose we want to try MongoDB. Let's create another deployment here. I'm going to say deployment. And this time what I'm going to do is I want to create, of course I have to say kubectl. I forgot that, stupid of me. So kubectl or K, whatever shortcut you're using. And I'm going to call this as my Mongo. And this is a deployment. And of course I got to standardize the image. I'm going to call the Mongo default image. So I'm just going to give it as Mongo. And you see Mongo is created. So if you look at the pods, there's one for my Nginx and my Mongo is just starting. You can give this a little, then you can see that the configuration goes on. I can also look at the kubectl logs. Okay, so I can say kubectl logs, and the only thing is I got to give the deployment name here. So I'm going to copy this. This is going to take a bit of time, but never mind. So you can see that if I look into the logs, it's not started yet, so it's yelling at me. So if I say get parts, it's still creating. Mongo, as you can see, has got a few setup. Okay, so it's still going to run. And let me try again. It's not fully run yet. So when I say get pods, you can see that it basically tells me that the system is running for 34-45 seconds. Now everything seems okay. And if I try to run the log file, I should be able to see the logs. That's really cool, right? So this is how you start redirecting your logs and other configuration details into separate files. So that makes it easy for you to be able to manage the deployments quite well. So this is roughly how MongoDB or Nginx or anything on the container works. Of course, disposability is important. We spoke about all the ways in which when we create nodes, we also create replicas. So if you look at get deployment now, you will see that there are two deployment files. And if you look at the replica sets here, okay, so when I say get all the replica sets, you can see that my Nginx is just one, but Mongo is basically trying to create a desired state. So if you give it some time, you will see that there are a few other versions of it running as well. So I created a few deployments, right? So you can see the different timestamps, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes. And the ones that are not useful, you can see that they are basically put to 0. And the only current one, which is the latest one, which was running on 3 minutes, 28 seconds, is active. The rest are just removed. Okay? And over a period of time, these things will be garbage collected as well. So it is right that I put these things back. So I'm going to say kubectl. And this time, instead of creating, I'm going to say delete deployment. So I'm going to say deployment. And of course, I'm going to say my Nginx. And this should remove my deployment Nginx. There's a typo in my kubectl, so that's why it's yelling at me. So this is done. I'm also going to remove my Mongo, okay, so that the state goes back to what it is. So if I simply go into the previous commands to say deployment, there is no deployment that is found, and naturally there is no replica sets as well. Okay. So I hope this gives you a hello world kind of view on what Kubernetes is. There is complete instructions on workshop 6. Feel free to try that, and of course that gives you your first flavor of Kubernetes. Another important bookkeeping that you got to do is you got to stop your server as well. So that's something that I missed out, so I'm just adding it, and you can see that your server has stopped, your dashboard is no longer in use. That's to just release the resources on whatever we have tried so far. Okay. So that's pretty much completes the life cycle of running the server and putting it down when it is. So the next time you try the status command, you will see that all the services we used are no longer active. So you can see that it stopped and there is no longer active. That completes my full activity on Minikube first demo.